You're listening to the audiobook for Elvis and the Beatles by Trina Young. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved. Chapter 3, A Hard Day's Night in Germany. Quote, Mach Schau. German for, make a show. Hamburg nightclub owner, Bruno Koschmider. In March 1960, Elvis Presley was released from the U.S. Army after 2 years of required service. During the entire 2 years, Elvis performed his duties well as a soldier, but also spent his time worrying that his career would be over once he returned to civilian life. Elvis seemed to be a slightly different performer when he got out of the army, musically and stylistically. Here was the rock and roll rebel no longer growing sideburns, and now wearing a tuxedo on stage with Frank Sinatra. It was Sinatra, a professed hater of rock and roll, who hosted Presley's first public appearance since being discharged. A special edition of the Frank Sinatra show called Welcome Home Elvis aired in May 1960. Had 2 years in the army really changed Elvis? Jerry Schilling, member of the Memphis Mafia, later observed, quote, he, Elvis, went in as James Dean and came out as John Wayne, unquote. Rock and roll fans including the Beatles were upset that Elvis was moving away from his defiant style towards a more mainstream pop sound. However, there were many factors at play for Presley's subtle shift in musical style and image, the main reason being that his true passions were emerging. As the music changed during the 2 years he was in the army, Elvis felt compelled to follow the pop music trend rather than keep cranking out the 1950s-style rock and roll hits that he was famous for. Quote, most of the records in the top 50 sellers are rock and roll. But in the 2 years I was in the army, I think the music got better, Elvis said in September 1960. There wasn't so much of the wild stuff, unquote. Moving away from the wild stuff, Presley's first 3 singles out of the army were Stuck on You, It's Now or Never, and Are You Lonesome Tonight? These mellow ballads and pop songs all became #1 hits in the US in 1960. It's Now or Never, in particular, exposed Elvis to a more adult audience where many easy listening stations found they could play a Presley single for the first time. Also, having served in the military gave Presley more respectability with the establishment who censored him on the Ed Sullivan Show just a few years earlier. Quote, you get this new Elvis, the Elvis that Colonel Parker wanted, the Elvis that had grown up exactly the same way that his core audience had grown older, said historian Ernst Jorgensen. They had gone from teenagers to being young adults, so for him it was the perfect launch. The public widely accepted that, but obviously this was a transition, unquote. Presley's first album released after returning from the army, Elvis Is Back, was a mixture of pop and blues which expressed a newfound maturity combined with a subdued sensuality. Elvis also released his first gospel album in 1960 called His Hand in Mine. In addition to Presley's shift in musical style, there was also a shift in image a la John Wayne. Who could have predicted that Andy Warhol's painting of Elvis called Double Elvis from 1963 would be so prophetic? It was taken from a publicity still from Presley's 1960 film Flaming Star, which showed a Western-styled Elvis drawing a gun. Presley's first film after leaving the army was GI Blues, obviously inspired, yet loosely based on his real-life army experience. One Elvis fan was so upset by Presley's new conservative image in the film that she wrote a letter not only to Colonel Parker, but also to producer Hal Wallace, Paramount, the William Morris Agency and RCA. Quote, it was great for people who hate Elvis Presley, the fan wrote. It was everything that he isn't. Did you put a girdle on him? Did he have polio recently? There must be some explanation for all that lost motion, unquote. Quote, I always thought the army ruined Elvis, observed Paul McCartney. We liked Elvis's freedom as a trucker, as a guy in jeans with swivel-in hips, but didn't like him with the short haircut in the army calling everyone, sir. It just seemed he'd gone establishment, and his records after that weren't so good, unquote. In August 1960, just a few months after Elvis returned home from Germany, John, Paul, George, Stu, and Pete arrived in Hamburg, Germany to start performing at the Indra Club in the St. Pauli district on the Reeperbahn. Hamburg was a pivotal experience in the Beatles' career. With the demanding schedule, the lads perfected their craft by playing for several hours a night for months and months. Their musicianship and their confidence as performers were both enhanced. Due to the 8-hour sessions at the clubs, it was in Hamburg that George Harrison started sharing the lead singing duties with John and Paul. Shortly after the Beatles started playing at the Indra, the club owner moved them to the larger Kaiserkeller Club. It was there that they met a group of artists in Hamburg who had an impact on them personally and professionally. Artist Klaus Voormann discovered the Beatles when he walked into the Kaiserkeller one night in October 1960. He was so impressed with the group that the next day he brought his friend, photographer Astrid Kircher, to hear the Beatles play. Quote, "I first saw Rory Storm and the Hurricanes playing with Ringo on drums. I thought it was fantastic," Klaus recalled. Immediately, the next band came on and Stewart went first on stage and he looked really stunning. I thought he was the band leader because he looked the most, let's say, from the image, he looked the most interesting on first looks, unquote. Astrid, Klaus, and another photographer, Jürgen Vollmer, formed a tight-knit friendship with the Beatles while they were in Hamburg. Stewart Sutcliffe and Astrid immediately became a couple. Astrid was the first photographer to take professional quality photos of the Beatles. Her famous black and white portraits taken in the fall of 1960 show the Beatles dressed in leather jackets with their hair slicked back, an obvious influence of Elvis Presley, Gene Vincent, and the rebellious rock and roll image. Just 2 years later, this photo would seem worlds apart from the tailored suits the group wore when they became famous. Astrid described taking photos of the Beatles, quote, "Because they played such rough rock and roll music, I thought that would suit them very nicely to take pictures there between all the steel and all the stuff like that. But they were very, very professional and nice doing that session for me. They did whatever I wanted them to do. The thing is they trusted me, and that is the most important thing for a photographer if you take portraits of people. If they don't trust you, then you can forget it," unquote. In October 1960, the Beatles, they had dropped Silver from their name before they got to Hamburg, played on the same bill at the Kaiserkeller with the headlining act, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. The Beatles had met the band before in Liverpool, including their drummer, Richard Starkey, aka Ringo Starr. Ringo created his stage name around the end of 1959 when his band was playing at the Casbah in Liverpool. Richie, as he was known to his friends and family, started off with the stage name Rings because of the many rings he wore on his fingers, but it then evolved into Ringo. The Hurricanes were big fans of American cowboy movies. There was a character named Johnny Ringo in the 1957 film Gunfight at the OK Corral, and also John Wayne starred as Ringo Kid in the movie Stagecoach. Quote, "It was going to be Ringo Starkey, but that didn't really work, so I cut the name in half, added an R and had it put on the bass drum," Ringo explained. Meanwhile, the Beatles were adapting to the rough lifestyle of drugs, alcohol, and prostitutes in Hamburg. The German audiences would show their appreciation for the group by buying them more drinks. Quote, "We did crazy things," Pete Best recalled, "because once we were identified as, they called us the Verrückt Beatles, which was the crazy Beatles. They were expecting us to do crazy off-the-wall stuff, get up to crazy antics on stage, dress up in funny things, do things that were totally off the wall, so it became second nature for us. It was a release of frustration for ourselves," unquote. The German nightclub owner, Bruno Koschmider, would insist to the Beatles that they make a show, or Mach-Show in German. This constant pressure pushed the Beatles to progress very quickly as musicians and singers. Quote, "I think that's where we found our style, we developed our style," George Harrison said about Hamburg in a 1963 interview. "This fellow there, he used to say, 'You've got to make a show for the people.' He used to come up every night shouting Mach-Show, so we used to Mach-Show. John used to dance around like a gorilla and we'd all knock our heads together, and things like that," unquote. On October 15, 1960, the Beatles, meaning John, Paul, George and Ringo, had their first ever unofficial recording session together by chance. On a visit to Hamburg, their manager Alan Williams asked John, Paul and George to record a few songs as the backup band for a singer he wanted to promote as a crooner. That singer was Lou Walters, the Hurricanes' second vocalist. Walters asked his bandmate, Ringo Starr, to play drums on the session. According to Beatles biographer, Mark Luizone, The songs they recorded included the Porgy and Bess tune, Summertime, and the Peggy Lee hit, Fever. Unfortunately, no copy of this recording exists. It was in Hamburg that Ringo's friendship with the Beatles grew, and so did their mutual admiration for each other. Quote, he often came across to the Beatles' table and he always had a joke, and his one joke would trigger off the next person, so every time Ringo came near the Beatles it was happiness, recalled Voorman. I know the three of them discussed changing their drummer while they were in Hamburg, because I heard them, he continued. It wasn't said too explicitly because you don't just go and steal someone else's drummer, but they always liked Ringo, unquote. Although Elvis Presley had left Germany in March 1960, the Beatles brought the spirit of Elvis back to the country by playing many of his songs during their gigs in Hamburg. One of the only Beatles covers of Presley preserved on tape in those early days was I'm Gonna Sit Right Down and Cry Over You. The song can be found on the album, The Beatles Live, at the Star Club in Hamburg, Germany 1962. This song is an interesting study of how artists influence each other and interpret the song differently. Roy Hamilton, a singer that greatly influenced Elvis, first released the song in November 1953. His version had a pop and jazz feel to it. Then Elvis Presley took the song and added a country sound to it, speeding up the tempo. Presley's version was released on his first album, Elvis Presley, in 1956. The Beatles took it a step further, speeding it up even more, and adding a rock and roll spin to the song. Quote, it was Hamburg that had done it, said John Lennon. That's where we'd really developed. To get the Germans going and keep it up for 12 hours at a time, we'd really had to hammer. We would never have developed as much if we'd stayed at home. We had to try anything that came into our heads in Hamburg. There was nobody to copy from. We played what we liked best. The Germans liked it, as long as it was loud. But it was only back in Liverpool that we realized the difference and saw what had happened to us while everyone else was playing Cliff Richard, unquote. The Beatles were also influenced by rock and roll star, Gene Vincent. His song, Be-Bop-A-Lula, became a top 10 hit in 1956. Many compared him to Elvis. John Lennon sang Be-Bop-A-Lula with the Quarrymen the day that he met Paul McCartney in July 1957. That beginning, well, always made my hair stand on end, Lennon said. Paul McCartney recalls that Be-Bop-A-Lula was the first record he ever bought. Quote, it made us realize how special it is for people to buy records because we didn't have much money and you think about your purchase. All your money that week would go on that record. I just loved it. It's such a beautiful record, unquote. The Beatles first saw Gene Vincent and his Blue Caps perform Be-Bop-A-Lula in the movie The Girl Can't Help It, starring Jane Mansfield. The movie, which was shown in Liverpool in the spring of 1957, also featured performances by Little Richard and Eddie Cochran. The Beatles used to perform Be-Bop-A-Lula live in the late 50s, early 60s with John singing lead. The song remained a favorite especially for John and Paul, who both recorded it later during the solo years. The Beatles covered other Gene Vincent songs including Ain't She Sweet. They performed the song during a recording session as the backup band for Tony Sheridan in Hamburg in 1961. It was later released on the Beatles Anthology 1. Although the song had been recorded by numerous artists including Frank Sinatra, the Beatles' version was influenced by Gene Vincent's version, although it still sounds distinctively different. Quote, Gene Vincent's recording of Ain't She Sweet is very mellow and high-pitched and I used to do it like that, John Lennon explained, but the Germans said, harder, harder, they all wanted it a bit more like a march, so we ended up doing a harder version, unquote. The Beatles also imitated Gene Vincent's all-other style of dress. In Hamburg, the Beatles quickly adopted the uniform look of dressing in leather jackets and leather pants. In this aspect, the Beatles were years ahead of Elvis. Although Elvis will always be remembered for the iconic leather outfit that he wore on his 1968 television special, the Beatles wore their leather outfits on stage several years earlier during their Hamburg days. Quote, we just bought leather jackets, not for the group, John Lennon explained in 1963. One person bought one, I can't remember, and then we all liked them, so it ended up we're all on stage with them. We'd always worn jeans, 'cause we didn't have anything else at the time. So we went back to Germany and we had a bit more money the second time, so we bought leather pants and we looked like four Gene Vincents, only a bit younger. And that was it, we just kept the leather gear until Brian came along, unquote. In addition to clothes, the hairstyles of both Elvis Presley and the Beatles played such an important role in their image and popularity. The two haircuts couldn't have been more different, yet they both represented youth rebellion against the establishment, a core value of rock and roll. Elvis had been combing his hair back in a pompadour style starting in high school, reminiscent of movie idols like Tony Curtis and Marlon Brando. He grew long sideburns mimicking truck drivers he used to see around Memphis. Elvis definitely stood out among his buzzcut peers. He was different and he was not shy in expressing his own style. As Elvis became a global phenomenon, many teenage boys mimicked his hairstyle. Sometimes they suffered for it. In December 1956, it was reported that football players at a high school in Knoxville forcibly cut the hair of three Presley imitators, described as anyone who wears his hair in sideburns, thick on the top and sides and shaggy at the neck. Meanwhile, a 16-year-old boy in Michigan was not admitted to two high schools due to his Elvis Presley haircut. As shown in their famous Hamburg photos taken in 1960, the Beatles all wore their hair in pompadour style with long sideburns, similar to Elvis. After meeting Elvis in 1965, John Lennon told Memphis Mafia member, Jerry Schilling, quote, "I couldn't say this to Elvis last night, but you see these sideburns? I almost got kicked out of high school trying to be like Elvis," unquote. While Elvis styled his hair with deliberate intention, in 1961 the Beatles fell into their new look, which would become known as their signature mop-top hairstyle, inspiring a mass sale of Beatle wigs when they hit it big. The irony was that in 1956, Presley's hair was considered long. Just imagine what detractors of Elvis's hairstyle thought of the length of the Beatles' hair only 8 years later in 1964. The first Beatle to get his hair styled in this way, with bangs and a bowl-type cut as a departure from their Elvis-style do, was Stuart Sutcliffe. In November 1960, the Beatles were offered a gig at a more prestigious club in Hamburg. The owner of the Kaiser Keller, Bruno Koschmider, was not happy that the Beatles would be leaving to play at one of his competitors' clubs, the Top 10 Club. For revenge, Koschmider alerted the German authorities that George Harrison was only 17 and therefore considered underage. George was immediately deported back to England on November 21, 1960. A week later, Paul McCartney and Pete Best accidentally started a very minor fire in their room. They had no light, so they set fire to a condom so they could see. There was no damage to the room except for a singe mark on the wall. Koschmider had Paul and Pete arrested and deported for arson at the end of November. With no band left, John Lennon returned to Liverpool in December 1960, while Stuart stayed behind for a while with Astrid, who he was now engaged to. He decided to enroll in an art school in Hamburg. Stuart did come back to Liverpool in February 1961 for a brief visit with his family. Stuart continued to perform with the Beatles in local gigs, even though Paul was not happy with his bass playing. One fateful night Stuart was viciously attacked outside one of the clubs. He suffered a tragic blow to the head that would ultimately cause his death a year later. Stuart returned to Germany in March 1961. It was then that Astrid gave him the infamous bowl haircut. When the other Beatles returned to Hamburg in April 1961, they initially made fun of Stuart's new haircut. However, George was the next Beatle to give the haircut a try. Quote, "All this, I invented this hairstyle, is just a lot of rubbish, because in my art school all the boys used to have this haircut," Astrid Kircher explained. "First, Stuart wanted to have the haircut Klaus and Jürgen had, so I cut Stuart's hair, and then George came along and asked me to cut his hair. So I only cut Stuart's and George's hair," unquote. It wasn't until October 1961 when John and Paul finally took the plunge. They took a trip to Paris for John's 21st birthday and they went to visit Jürgen Vollmer, who was studying photography in Paris. Jürgen had been introduced to the haircut by Astrid. John and Paul asked Jürgen to cut their hair to look like his. Quote, "We didn't really start that," Paul McCartney explained. The impression that got over was that it was just us, that we'd started it all. We kept saying, but there's millions of people in art schools who look like this. We're just the spokesman for it, unquote. Pete Best was the only member of the group not to adopt this new hairstyle where the hair was combed forward. Kircher said that Pete could not wear this hairstyle since he had naturally curly hair. Meanwhile, during the Beatles' 3-month gig at the Top 10 Club, which began in April 1961, Stuart Sutcliffe announced that he was quitting the group. Quote, "The problem with Stu was that he couldn't play bass guitar," Paul McCartney explained. "We had to turn him away in photographs because he'd be doing F-sharp and we'd be holding G. Stu and I had a fight once on stage in Hamburg. The thing that concerned me was the music, and that we get on musically, and we didn't. Same with Pete Best," unquote. However, many others contradict what McCartney has stated, insisting that Stewart was a good bass player in his own right. Quote, "The Beatles were best when Stewart was still in the band," says Klaus Voormann. "To me it had more balls, it was even more rock and roll when Stewart was playing the bass and Paul was playing piano or another guitar. The band was, somehow, as a rock and roll band, more complete," unquote. With Stewart's departure, the group was faced with a dilemma: who was going to play bass? Quote, "At that point I said, we're not going to get a fifth person in the band," George Harrison explained. "One of us three is going to be the bass player, and it's not going to be me." And John said, "It's not going to be me," and Paul didn't seem to mind the idea, unquote. In the spring of 1961, Paul purchased his first Hofner violin bass at a local Hamburg Steinway music shop. It became the second Beatles guitar purchased in Hamburg that would become iconic. During their first trip to Hamburg in 1960, John had purchased his Rickenbacker. Quote, "I was with John Lennon when he purchased his famous Rickenbacker guitar from Musikhaus Hummel in the center of Hamburg," recalls Rick Richards of the Jets, another British band performing in Hamburg at the time. Incidentally, John didn't go in to specifically buy a Rickenbacker. It so happened that it was the only American guitar in stock and he went for it. Maybe if they had only an Epiphone or a Gretsch, for instance, he would have bought something different, unquote. In June 1961 in Hamburg, the Beatles were offered to record as the backup group for British singer Tony Sheridan. Listed as the Beat Brothers, the Beatles recorded 2 songs, My Bonnie and The Saints, as Tony Sheridan's backing band. Quote, "They didn't like our name and said, 'Change to the Beat Brothers, this is more understandable for the German audience,'" Paul McCartney recalled. "We went along with it, it was a record," unquote. After the Beatles returned from their second stint in Hamburg in the fall of 1961, My Bonnie was gaining steam in Liverpool. My Bonnie was first released in West Germany in October 1961. Stuart Sutcliffe, who had stayed in Germany with Astrid, sent a copy of the record to George Harrison in Liverpool. George then gave the copy to disc jockey Bob Wooler, who started playing the record around local clubs. As a result, fans of the Beatles started to request the single at local record shops in Liverpool. Quote, "We all wanted it to be a hit even though it wasn't even released in the UK," said Bob Wooler. "There was only one record shop that took any interest in that record. That happened to be the policy of Brian Epstein at his Whitechapel record store, that if you asked for a record, as a shrewd businessman, he would make it his business to get that record for you if it was humanly possible," unquote. According to Brian Epstein's own book, A Cellarful of Noise, a man named Raymond Jones came into the NEMS record shop in Liverpool on October 28, 1961 and requested My Bonnie by the Beatles. But that's not the first time Brian Epstein had heard about the Beatles. Bill Harry, editor of Mersey Beat, says that Brian used to sell the newspaper in his record store and even wrote a music column in the paper as early as August 1961. According to Harry, Epstein was well aware of the Beatles long before he ventured into the cavern to see them for himself. However, the popularity of the My Bonnie record at NEM's shop led Brian to seek out the Beatles and watch them perform at the Cavern Club on November 9, 1961. Brian was so impressed by the Beatles, but it took him a few weeks before he offered to be their manager. Quote, "This was quite a new world really for me," explained Epstein in 1964. The Beatles were then, as 4 lads on that rather dimly lit stage, somewhat ill-clad, and their presentation left little to be desired as far as I was concerned, because I've been interested in the theater and acting for a long time. But amongst all that, something tremendous came over and I was immediately struck by their music, their beat and their sense of humor on stage. And even afterwards when I met them, I was struck again by their personal charm, and it was there that really it all started." Unquote. Even though Brian Epstein had no previous experience managing pop artists, he had a strong passion for the Beatles. He saw their potential and was persistent in helping them succeed. He never doubted their talent, and always claimed they'd be bigger than Elvis. Quote, "He started talking to us about the record that had created the demand," George Harrison described. "He came back several times and talked to us. It seemed there was something he wanted to say, but he wouldn't come out with it. He just kind of watched us and studied what we were doing." Unquote. Finally, in early December, Epstein made the offer to be the Beatles' manager. The Beatles liked Brian because he was a wealthy businessman who had contacts in the record industry. They accepted his management offer in hopes that he would be able to get them a record deal. Brian rearranged his life to follow his instinct in helping the band achieve success. He was their biggest supporter. Before running his NEMS record shop, he had worked for several years in his family-owned furniture stores. Brian proved to be good in marketing by increasing sales overnight with his promotion and display tactics. Quote, "I liked the way they worked and the obvious enthusiasm they put into their numbers," Brian said. "Each had something which I could see would be highly commercial if only someone could push it to the top. They were different characters, but they were so obviously part of the whole. Quite frankly, I was excited about their prospects, provided some things could be changed." Unquote. To make them more presentable to the public, Brian wanted to change their appearance. With help from Paul, who also had a keen sense for public relations, Brian convinced the Beatles to exchange their leather pants and jackets for tailored suits. He also suggested that they stop eating on stage and bow at the end of their performances. Quote, "We decided we didn't want to look ridiculous," explained Paul McCartney in 1963. "More often than not, too many people would laugh, which was stupid, and we didn't want to appear as a gang of idiots. And Brian suggested that we just wore ordinary suits. So we just got what we thought looked like good suits and just got rid of the leather gear." Unquote. While Brian Epstein played a major role in convincing the Beatles to start wearing tailored suits, Colonel Parker had a hand in one of Elvis Presley's most iconic outfits. Colonel Parker came up with the idea to get Presley's famous gold lame suit made. The suit became iconic when Elvis wore it throughout his 1957 concert tour across the US and Canada, and later on the album cover for 50 Million Elvis Fans Can't Be Wrong. The gold leaf tuxedo with silver rhinestones included a jacket, trousers, belt, shoes and necktie. Parker commissioned Nudie Cohn of Nudie's Rodeo Tailors to design the flashy gold suit, which cost $2,500 at the time. Just a few months earlier, Nudie had designed a red and white cowboy outfit that Elvis famously wore when he sang, "Let Me Be Your Teddy Bear," in his second film, Loving You. Nudie, a flamboyant country and western tailor, was famous for putting rhinestones on clothing for many country stars of the day. Colonel Parker, inspired by a gold costume that Liberace wore, told him, quote, "I want you to make something for Elvis that's out of this world spectacular." Unquote. While the fans loved the outfit, which seemed to fit with Elvis's rock and roll image, the one person who did not like the suit was Elvis himself. For starters, lame is not an easy fabric to wear since it is made of thin ribbons of metallic threads. The gold pants created problems for Elvis since the gold sequins would flake off when he slid on his knees while performing. On March 28, 1957, Elvis wore the gold lame suit for the first time in public at the International Amphitheater in Chicago. However, during his concert tour, he only wore the full suit a few times. For most of his 1957 performances, Elvis substituted black pants for the gold. He still wore the gold belt and jacket, but rarely wore the gold shoes or necktie. As he explained to a Vancouver DJ in 1957, he stopped wearing the gold pants since the creases were not flattering. When costume designer Bill Ballou wanted to recreate the gold lame suit for Presley's 1968 television special, Elvis refused. He told Ballou, "I always hated that suit and I won't wear it." Instead, Ballou ended up creating a silver sequin jacket with black trim that Elvis wore with black pants. Wearing the gold lame suit would not be the only time that Elvis heeded to the Colonel's wishes, even though he preferred not to. In less than a month of being their manager, Brian Epstein was able to get the Beatles an audition with Decca Records. On January 1, 1962, the Beatles played 3 of their own compositions along with 12 covers during the audition in London. Unfortunately, Decca turned them down. Quote, "I think Decca expected us to be all polished," John Lennon said. "We were just doing a demo. They should have seen our potential," unquote. The one good thing that came out of the audition was that the songs were recorded and the tapes were given to Brian Epstein. He was then able to use these tapes when approaching other record companies about the Beatles. However, John, Paul and George were devastated that they were rejected by the Decca label. They surprisingly did not tell drummer Pete Best about the outcome of the audition for 6 weeks, signaling a major rift between them. Quote, "We really thought that was it, that was the end," John Lennon recalled. "They always said it was too bluesy or too rocky. Too much rock and roll and that's all over now, they used to keep telling us," unquote. But all was not lost. Maybe their "toppermost of the poppermost" mantra was really working. John Lennon explained, quote, "When the Beatles were depressed, thinking that the group was going nowhere and this is a shoddy deal, and we're in a shoddy dressing room, I'd say, 'Where we goin', fellas?' And they'd go, 'To the top, Johnny.' And I'd say, 'Where's that, fellas?' And they'd say, 'To the toppermost of the poppermost.' And I'd say, 'Right,' and we'd all sort of cheer up," unquote. In early February 1962, the Beatles auditioned for the BBC radio show when they were in Manchester. This time, they were hired with the higher-ups commenting, "An unusual group, not as rocky as most, more country and western with a tendency to play music." On March 7, 1962, the Beatles started their 3-year run on the BBC. They would appear a total of 52 times on various BBC radio shows through May 1965. Many of the performances were later released on the double CD sets, The Beatles Live, at the BBC, and On Air Live, at the BBC, Volume 2. Surprisingly, the Beatles never officially recorded any cover versions of Elvis Presley songs, except for Long Tall Sally, which was primarily Little Richard's song. But on the BBC radio show Live Recordings, the Beatles sang 4 different songs released by Elvis in the 1950s, That's All Right, Mama, lead sung by Paul McCartney, I Got a Woman, and I'm Gonna Sit Right Down and Cry Over You, lead sung by John Lennon, and I Forgot to Remember to Forget, lead sung by George Harrison. According to author Mark Luizone, the Beatles, first as the Quarrymen, performed Heartbreak Hotel live from 1957 until 1961 in Liverpool, and then later in Hamburg and elsewhere. It is unclear whether the lead vocal was sung by John or Paul or both. Sadly, no recorded version is known to survive. On April 10, 1962, Stuart Sutcliffe died suddenly of a brain hemorrhage at the age of 22. Although he had quit the group a year earlier, it was a devastating loss for the Beatles, especially John Lennon, who considered him his best friend. In May 1962, after being turned down by every record label in London, the Beatles' manager, Brian Epstein, finally got them a recording contract with EMI's small label, Parlophone. The only contingent was that the Beatles come in for an audition at Abbey Road Studios. If the producer, George Martin, liked what he heard, then the contract would be finalized. The Beatles had already been turned down by EMI's pop music labels, but a contact at the HMV record shop in London recommended to Brian that he approach Parlophone, an EMI label originally founded in Germany. Parlophone recorded classical, jazz and comedy records. Record producer, George Martin, was appointed head of the label in 1955 at the ripe young age of 29, which was extremely young for that position. Finally, Brian Epstein's perseverance had paid off. On June 6, 1962, the Beatles auditioned for Parlophone. George Martin has said in interviews that although he thought their music needed some work, he was struck by the Beatles' personal charm. Martin offered the Beatles a standard contract with minimal royalties. Since the Beatles had been rejected so many times, Brian agreed to the offer. This would be the beginning of a string of business deals for the Beatles which gave them less money than they deserved. An important difference between the management of Elvis versus the Beatles is that when the Beatles hired Brian Epstein, they were considered underdogs in the record business. Brian Epstein took lower-paying deals with their long-term potential in mind. Meanwhile, it was the opposite for Colonel Parker, who thought in the short term, holding out for as much money from deal to deal. When Colonel Parker teamed up with Elvis, Presley's star was on the rise and his popularity was growing daily. The Colonel reportedly said to Elvis, quote, "You stay talented and sexy, and I'll make amazing deals that'll make us both rich as Rajas," unquote. Colonel Parker already had many connections in the entertainment business when he met Elvis, which helped take Presley to the next level of his career. However, Brian Epstein was a newbie in the music industry and was learning as he went along. Brian Epstein was only 27 years old when he started managing the Beatles, while Colonel Parker was 46 years old when he officially became Presley's manager. Colonel Parker looked to Elvis almost like a son, while Brian Epstein wasn't that much older than the Beatles and the relationship was a bit different. The difference in age and experience of their managers would play a key role in the relationship between these two musical phenomena in the years to come. Peter Brown, who was Brian Epstein's and the Beatles' personal assistant, believes that Brian's primary motivation for helping the Beatles was because he was in love with John Lennon. Bill Harry, former editor of the Liverpool newspaper, Mersey Beat, refutes that theory, claiming that Brian became interested in the Beatles because he observed how popular they were locally through Mersey Beat. However, John Lennon set the record straight in a 1980 interview shortly before he died, quote, "I was on holiday with Brian Epstein in Spain, in 1963, where the rumors went around that he and I were having a love affair. Well, it was almost a love affair, but not quite. It was never consummated. But it was a pretty intense relationship," unquote. Whatever his true motivation, there is no denying that Brian Epstein was the impetus to the Beatles' career. Having a manager that was supportive and caring helped the Beatles break down industry barriers and allowed them the creative freedom that a traditional manager would never have put up with. Quote, "I think there is no doubt that had they not had a manager of Brian Epstein's determination, I don't think that they would have emerged from Liverpool," said Ray Coleman, biographer of John Lennon and Brian Epstein. "Without Brian Epstein, we wouldn't have seen the Beatles. That's my strong view," unquote. In August 1962, the Beatles told Brian Epstein to fire Pete Best. An official reason why was never revealed, but the main excuse that Brian offered Pete was that the Beatles and George Martin did not believe he was a good enough drummer. At first, Brian Epstein did not agree with this decision. Pete Shotton says Brian did not want to replace Pete with Ringo since Pete was so popular among the fans, but the Beatles insisted. It is true that George Martin wanted to hire a session drummer for their first recording session because he believed Pete's drumming was more appropriate for live concerts versus a recording studio. But George Martin says he never told the Beatles to fire Pete. It turns out the Beatles had been contemplating for some time to kick Pete out of the group. And once George Martin expressed the need to use a session drummer, they seized the opportunity to sack Pete. Quote, "We met Ringo in Hamburg and we liked his style," John Lennon recalled, "but we'd only just got the other drummer so we couldn't do anything about it," unquote. In an exclusive article in Mersey Beat, the Beatles commented, "Pete left the group by mutual agreement. There were no arguments or difficulties, and this has been an entirely amicable decision," unquote. Mona Best, Pete's mother, claimed that the other three were jealous of Pete's popularity and that's why they fired him. She was also hurt since she had helped them acquire concert gigs and helped manage them for almost 2 years. While it seems that there was a personality clash between Pete Best and the other three Beatles, Paul McCartney has stated that the Beatles were more impressed with Ringo Starr's drumming. Initially, the Liverpool fans were outraged at this decision. At the Cavern Club in Liverpool on August 19, 1962, fans got violent over the replacement of Pete Best with Ringo Starr. Fans would chant, "Pete forever, Ringo never." That night was Ringo's Cavern debut as a Beatle and the Beatles were attacked as they entered the club. George received a black eye in the incident. To be kicked out of the group on the eve of their success was devastating for Pete Best, but he went on to play in his own band throughout the years, albeit to mediocre success. In 1995, when the Beatles Anthology 1 was released, Pete finally got compensated for his years as a Beatle. Many of the early recordings featured Pete on drums and he was paid accordingly. Meanwhile, the belief that Ringo got lucky when he was asked to join the Beatles is a myth. The truth is the Beatles were the ones who got lucky. Ringo was seen as a local celebrity in Liverpool as the top drummer in one of the top bands, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. The Beatles had always been impressed by him and vice versa. In terms of personality, Ringo was a much better match for the Beatles. He was laid back, happy-go-lucky, and had a great sense of humor. Upon joining the Beatles, he quickly got rid of his beard and adopted the Beatles' mop-top haircut. As Ringo said in 1964, quote, "I was lucky to be on their wavelength when I joined the group. I had to be or I wouldn't have lasted. They all have strong personalities and unless you can match it, you're in a bit of trouble," unquote. Ringo had a love for rock and roll just like John, Paul, and George. Ringo said about Elvis, quote, "I couldn't believe it when Elvis came out. Just this lad with sideboards and shaking his pelvis and being absolutely naughty. Before Elvis we'd always had to listen to men, as opposed to guys who were just a bit older or around our own age. Bill Haley was like my dad," unquote. As Paul McCartney recalls, when Ringo first played with the Beatles, John, Paul and George all looked at each other, with the gut feeling knowing that Ringo was the perfect fit. Quote, "One night our drummer Pete Best wasn't available, so Ringo sat in. And I remember the moment when he started playing, I think it was Ray Charles's What Did I Say, and most of the drummers couldn't nail the drum part, but Ringo nailed it. Yeah, Ringo nailed it. I remember the moment just standing there and looking at John, and then looking at George, and the look on our faces was all, yeah, what is this, and then that was the moment, that was the beginning, really, of the Beatles," unquote. The Beatles lineup was finally complete. But before there was John, Paul, George and Ringo, there was Elvis, Bill, Scotty and DJ. Of course, Elvis was a solo artist from day one. But that didn't mean that he didn't have a tight-knit band that backed him up, especially in the early days. Guitarist Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black as the Blue Moon Boys became Presley's band beginning with the release of That's All Right, Mama, in July 1954. In October 1954, they added DJ Fontana as the drummer. Scotty, Bill and DJ were all an essential part of Presley's success in those early concert days. Quote, "Moore, with Black and drummer DJ Fontana, helped create the quintessential rock band identity, guitarist, bassist, drummer, singer," unquote. However, when Elvis got drafted into the Army in 1958, the Blue Moon Boys officially broke up. In 1959, Black joined another band which became Bill Black's Combo. They enjoyed recording success in the early 1960s and were voted Billboard's #1 instrumental group of 1961. Sadly, Bill Black died in 1965 at the age of 39 from a brain tumor. In 1974, Linda McCartney gave her husband Paul the infamous Elvis stand-up bass as a gift for his 32nd birthday. She purchased it from Bill Black's family. In 1995, McCartney used it on a new Beatles song called Real Love. Quote, "I can't honestly say that Heartbreak Hotel is Elvis's best record," Paul McCartney explained in 2005. "I love Elvis so much that for me to choose a favorite would be like singling out one of Picasso's paintings. What I will say is that it's Elvis's most alarming performance. When I hear it, I always get this image in my head. Elvis driving his Lincoln down the interstate on a clear night in Tennessee. The stars are twinkling. The air is balmy. They're on their way to a show, Bill Black and Scotty Moore in the back, with Bill's double bass strapped to the car roof. And now that bass belongs to me. It's my link to Heartbreak Hotel," unquote. The Beatles officially entered EMI Studios in London as signed artists on September 4, 1962 with their new drummer, Ringo Starr. During this first proper recording session, they recorded Love Me Do, written by Lennon and McCartney and several other songs. Unsatisfied with Ringo's drumming on Love Me Do, George Martin hired session drummer, Andy White, to play at the next session on September 11, 1962. During that first recording session, George Martin gave the Beatles a song he thought would be a good choice for a single called "How Do You Do It?" by Mitch Murray. However, the Beatles took a stand and told him they wanted to release one of their own songs instead, which helped set a precedent for their future artist-producer relationship. Quote, "That's one of the magic moments of the Beatles," recalls Ringo Starr in 2016. "I remember that moment so vivid. Thank God we stood up for ourselves. We just want to do Lennon and McCartney songs. We actually looked him in the eye, which was very heavy for those days, 'cause he was the producer and we were the lads. He took a chance on us. He joined in, unquote. Quote, "We wouldn't let them put it out," John Lennon explained. "We said, we'd sooner have no contract than put that crap out all the tantrums bit. We thought it was rubbish compared with Love, Love Me Do. We thought ours had more meaning," unquote. In September 1962, the Beatles had recorded their first single to be released, "Love Me Do/PS I Love You," produced by George Martin. Andy White plays on "Love Me Do," the album version, while Ringo plays on "Love Me Do," the single. However, "Love Me Do" did not immediately become a hit. In fact, it struggled for a while, climbing up the charts after it was released in October 1962. In December 1962, the single peaked at number 17 on the British charts. Elvis Presley's "Return to Sender" happened to be number 1 in the UK that week. There is a myth that Brian Epstein purposely bought 10,000 copies of the Beatles' first single, "Love Me Do," in order to get it higher on the UK charts. Beatles historian and author, Mark Lewisohn, definitively states in his book, Tune In, The Beatles, All These Years, Volume 1, that Epstein did not do this and that this nasty rumor unfairly casts a blight on his integrity. As John Lennon stated, quote, "It sold so many in Liverpool the first 2 days, because they were all waiting for us to make it, that the dealers down in London thought there was a fiddle on. That Mr. Epstein feller up there is cheating. But he wasn't," unquote. George Martin was not a pop music producer. He had classical training and had produced artists such as Sophia Loren, Shirley Bassey, and comedians, the Goons, who the Beatles were fans of. For him to take an interest in producing a group like the Beatles was a matter of fate. Quote, "When we first met George, we loved him because he took a chance on us," recalls Ringo Starr. "No one else would take a chance, with a name like that, and you come from Liverpool, not a chance in hell," unquote. George Martin was also acting as the head of A&R, Artists and Repertoire, for the Parlophone label, so he was motivated to help make this new group that he signed as successful as possible. Quote, "George had done no rock and roll when we met him and we had never been in a studio, so we did a lot of learning together," said John Lennon. How rare could it be to have a classically trained musician producing a pop group? Luckily, both sides were open-minded enough to work with each other. The combination proved ingenious, especially as the Beatles' music progressed. Quote, "I think the Beatles would have made it as great musicians whether I was there or not," observed George Martin. "I think the fact that I was there helped out, but probably got there more quickly," unquote. In a similar fashion to George Martin and the Beatles, Sam Phillips had taken a chance on Elvis 8 years earlier in 1954. Here was Elvis, a true unknown, since he had virtually no performing experience under his belt. He literally walked in off the street and got a record deal, based on his raw vocal talent. Elvis had to wait a year before he finally got his chance at Sun Records, but the patience and persistence paid off. Quote, "I think the most important thing a producer can do is to create a vibe of safety in the room," explained producer Don Was. "It's okay to go out on a limb. That it's cool to go to a very vulnerable space, where if it doesn't work right, it could be embarrassing. Don't be afraid to fail," unquote. That's exactly what happened with Elvis. He walked into the studio planning to win over Phillips by singing pop and country songs. He walked out with "That's All Right," a rock and roll song that did not sound like anything currently on the market. The fact that Elvis sounded black to many was not due to the particular songs he sang, but rather to the intensity, fervor, and feeling he conveyed when he sang them. To Sam Phillips, it was always about freeing the soul of his singers, says Elvis historian Ernst Jorgensen. Most of these people who came to him, like Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Roy Orbison, they all shared this enormous insecurity. His magic was to pull it out of them, whatever it was that they had inside, unquote. With Sam Phillips' guidance, Presley had popularized the new genre called rock and roll. However, Phillips ran a small label and had the freedom to release whatever he wanted. Once Presley moved to RCA, there was a strong chance that the record label would put pressure on him to go more mainstream country. Quote, "Sam gave me the best advice I ever got," Elvis told friend and Memphis DJ, George Klein in 1957. He said, "Whatever you do, wherever you go, don't let them change your style." He said that when I went to Nashville, I had to look out for the country guys because they resented what I was doing. Sam said, "Don't let them put you in a country bag. You've got to stand up for yourself." He was right, unquote. So when Chet Atkins, the famous country guitarist and producer, was at Presley's first Nashville RCA recording session, he started trying to give Elvis's guitarist, Scotty Moore, some pointers. Elvis saw that as a red flag. He went up to Atkins and said, "Mr. Atkins, we appreciate your guidance, but we've got our own style and I wish you wouldn't tell my guitar player how to play." "I had to do it. I had to speak up," Elvis explained to Klein. "It wasn't my nature, but I had to do it. My career was on the line," unquote. It was in these subtle, yet powerful ways that Elvis would virtually become his own record producer, especially in the first few years of working with RCA. He would do take after take in the studio until he was happy with the result. He would listen to the recordings over and over again. He also had a brilliant instinct for selecting the best songs to sing. Quote, "He did it all really," recalled Presley's drummer, DJ Fontana. He chose the tunes, chose the arrangements, chose what he wanted to hear on guitar, bass, piano, whatever. He produced the sessions himself, really. We had what I call clock watchers. "Hey, Elvis, that's 2:15, oh, that's perfect time." That's all they'd ever say and write down the numbers and stuff. But unless he was happy with it, they just kept going, unquote. In name, Steve Sholes, head of A&R for RCA's country division, served as the producer for most of Presley's recording sessions, with occasional help from Chet Atkins, between 1956 and 1966, excluding the sessions for the movie soundtracks. However, he acted more as a supervisor organizing the sessions and less as a hands-on producer. Quote, "I happen to be the greatest admirer of Steve Sholes," described Sam Phillips. "He was a person of the utmost integrity, but he was not a producer. Steve was just at every session, and he kept his mouth shut," unquote. Elvis used to call George Klein at the Memphis radio station he worked at and ask him to play his new song on air at 2 a.m. in the morning, when not many people were listening, so he could see how it sounded over the radio. Then he would call the engineers at RCA and have them tweak the recordings. Elvis knew that listening to the record in person sounded a lot different than hearing it on the radio, and he wanted to maximize the sound for radio airplay. Elvis did not get recognition for being one of the greatest rock and roll producers, says George Klein. But he knew exactly how to bring a song to life in the studio, often drawing on everything he'd learned from working with Sam Phillips. Though Elvis didn't have the training to tell a band what specific notes to play, he had an unbelievable ear and was very skilled at communicating to musicians the structure and the feel of what he wanted, while always leaving room for great players to improvise, unquote. The achievements spoke for themselves. In 1956, Elvis had 4 number-1 hits and held the top spot for 25 weeks. At the end of 1956, Presley had 10 songs on Billboard's Top 100 Singles chart. Quote, "He had had a background there at Sun Records that I truly feel that gave him that inertia to go in and feel confidence in himself in what he wanted to do," said Sam Phillips. And even though he said, "Yes sir," to everybody and "No sir," he would tell them in his own way that this was his session when he went to RCA. That had a lot to do with Elvis Presley being what he became, unquote. After the Beatles came along, some would look down on Elvis for not writing his own songs. However, Elvis was a phenomenon in his own right due to his keen instinct for picking hit songs. The way he sang and musically interpreted songs written by other artists helped fuel the rock and roll revolution. Quote, "I take my time to do the right thing," Presley said. "I can't properly explain it, but it all begins with listening, and more listening. It all narrows down gradually. I listen for hours. For a week, 2 weeks. When I'm down to the songs I think I'll want to do, I call the session," unquote. Quote, "When you hear an Elvis Presley record, it really is an Elvis Presley production," said George Klein in 1957. "But nobody talks about that," unquote. Quote, "Elvis was top of the list, he was the ultimate groove," said Paul McCartney. "We didn't know he was taking it off blues, we thought it was him. We just heard Elvis singing Love Me Tender, didn't know anyone else had ever done it. Or, That's All Right Mama, or Hound Dog. It just added to his legend. How does he think of these things?" unquote. As a singer, Elvis would be classified as a second tenor, although he had an amazing 3-octave vocal range, tenor, baritone and bass. Quote, "He's basically self-taught in a tenor voice, or even using his bass voice by listening to groups," Priscilla Presley described. "He just really had a musical appreciation for all styles of music," unquote. In fact, a love of opera formed a bond between Elvis and Priscilla. They first met in September 1959 at a party at his house in Germany, while he was serving in the U.S. Army. Instantly taken with her beauty, Elvis talked with Priscilla Bolio in between performing impromptu songs while playing the piano. He thought she looked mature enough to be a junior or senior in high school, but Priscilla was only in 9th grade. Elvis was happy to talk to a girl from the States and was curious to find out what music the kids her age were listening to. A 14-year-old Priscilla assured Elvis they were all listening to his music. Then, Elvis asked Priscilla what kind of music she liked to listen to. She told him Mario Lanza, an American opera singer turned film star. "You're kidding. How do you know about Mario Lanza?" Elvis asked. Priscilla said she loved Lanza's album, The Student Prince. Elvis was impressed and said that was his favorite. Quote, "Elvis was a big lover of opera," Priscilla Presley explained. "He liked Mario Lanza very much. He loved the movie, The Student Prince, and he saw that 7 times. When I met him in Germany, he practiced his voice every single night in preparation for serving his time and getting back into singing again, and operatic songs he would sing as well as other songs to prepare his voice," unquote. How ironic, or coincidental, that the following year Elvis would record an operatic English version of the Italian standard O Sole Mio called It's Now or Never. Mario Lanza, who passed away in October 1959 at the young age of 38, had recorded his version of O Sole Mio in 1949. Could this song choice by Elvis have been influenced at all by Priscilla? "O Sole Mio has always been one of my favorite songs," Elvis told a reporter in 1960. "I liked the Tony Martin version, There's No Tomorrow, and I often play the record by Jan Peerce, the opera singer," unquote. While in Germany, Elvis recorded his own version of There's No Tomorrow and preserved it on tape in a private home recording sometime between April and December 1959. Elvis loved the song so much that he commissioned new lyrics to be written for him. The new song would be called It's Now or Never. Elvis recorded It's Now or Never after he got out of the Army in April 1960. It would become his biggest-selling single ever with international sales surpassing the 20 million mark. He was an incredible vocalist, Paul McCartney said about Elvis. "Try and do it sometime, we all have, and he is still the governor," unquote. While their first single, Love Me Do, was slowly climbing the charts, the Beatles kept playing local gigs in Liverpool. On October 12, 1962, the Beatles were the opening act for one of their rock and roll idols, Little Richard, at the Tower Ballroom in New Brighton. "Man, those Beatles are fabulous," Little Richard was quoted as saying in Mersey Beat. "If I hadn't seen them I'd never have dreamed they were white. They have a real authentic Negro sound," unquote. Author John Wiener disputes that Little Richard actually said those words, but acknowledges that the Beatles incorporated the black vocal group style into their own distinctive songs. Just 2 weeks later, the Beatles were on the bill with Little Richard again at the Liverpool Empire Theatre. Frida Kelly, the Beatles fan club secretary, was there. I just couldn't believe that the Beatles were on the Empire, the biggest theater in Liverpool. And I thought, this is it, they've made it, they're going to be famous one day, unquote. Soon after, Little Richard played with the Beatles again for 2 straight weeks in Hamburg. They'd come to my dressing room and eat there every night, Little Richard recalled. They didn't have any money, so I paid for their food. I used to buy steaks for John. They asked me, have you ever met Elvis Presley? Is he nice looking, unquote. The Beatles also got to know Gene Vincent when he came to Germany in the spring of 1962. Quote, there's still many a story going round about the escapades, especially with Gene Vincent, who was rather a wild guy, John Lennon recalled. We met Gene backstage. Backstage, I mean, it was a toilet and we were thrilled, unquote. From April to May 1962, the Beatles played 7 weeks at the Star Club in Hamburg. For the first 2 weeks, they shared the bill with Gene Vincent. When Gene Vincent did Bebopalula in Hamburg, he didn't do it the same, John Lennon said. It was a thrill to meet Gene Vincent and see him, but it was not Bebopalula. I'm a record fan, unquote. On July 1, 1962, Gene Vincent would share the bill with the Beatles at the Cavern Club in Liverpool. The following year, the Beatles toured with Roy Orbison in the UK from May to June 1963. After the tour, Roy Orbison said, "One day the Beatles could become big in America." The Beatles had come full circle. They were now moving in the same circles as the singers and musicians who had influenced them as teenagers. The Fab Four had succeeded in doing what Elvis Presley had done, combining black and white American music to create their own distinctive style. Just like Elvis, the Beatles had a broad range of musical tastes and could perform them all equally well, from rock and roll to country to pop to standards. There were no musical limits for the Beatles. Yet, the Beatles were still in awe of the pioneers of rock and roll who had inspired them. In 1964, the Beatles were excited to meet Fats Domino. At their request, they met him during their stop in New Orleans on their U.S. tour. 8 years later, John Lennon got to meet Chuck Berry, who he performed with in 1972 on The Mike Douglas Show. In 1974, John Lennon described how he felt meeting one of his teenage heroes, quote, "I could never quite see him as a human because there was one of my idols actually talking to me. I understood when I used to order a steak and something and the waiter just didn't hear me because he was too busy looking at me saying, 'It talks, it talks.' So I understand it in a way, because if I see any of those people from that period of my life when I was 16, I really don't know quite if I'm all there when I'm talking to them. It's sort of effort to see, oh, yeah, it's a human being, but it is Chuck Berry," unquote. The Beatles would be even more tongue-tied when they got to meet their ultimate idol, the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, in August 1965.